Is a patent a startup? Hello, and welcome back to Invent Anything. John Cronin here. In today's episode, we'll discover the intersection of entrepreneurship and intellectual property, basically, how patents and startups drive innovation and economic growth. We'll learn about patents, but offer a way to think about it, a robust platform for inventors that could be monetization and create and shape their market dynamics. But patents are just like startups. And we're going to explore the parallels between startups and patents. We're going to reveal shared principles of the both. You're going to actually see the relationship between patents and startups as we navigate sort of what is a patent and what is a startup, and lay the groundwork to actually show that patents are just like startups, from everything from market to product development to legal compliance to brand building. And in the end, you might think, or you may recognize, my goodness, by obtaining a patent, it's really creating a startup.
Inventions keep the world spinning. From fire in the wheel to today's high tech, inventions power change. Turn your inventions into reality. Learn how to get your ideas to market. This is Invent Anything with John Cronin.
So today we'll actually cover 6 topics. The first topic is a background. The next 2 topics, topic 2 and topic 3, are justifications of why a patent is a startup. And then in topic 4, we'll talk about the cornerstone of building value, how a patent and a startup are the same. And then we'll get right into sort of the parallels between a startup and a patent. And then we'll talk about how the processing and the obtaining of a patent actually prepares you for creating a great startup. I chose these 6 topics so that we could actually see sort of the beginnings and the sort of ends of how this topic unfolds. And actually, the justifications I chose to basically really convince us that a patent is a startup. Now, for the audience, this is interesting. Every time I do a podcast, I'm thinking about the audience. And so one audience, obviously, is if you're about to consider getting your first patent. But also, this is great for small companies who want to consider the value of patents in their startup. Maybe you don't have patents yet and you have a startup. So maybe this will help you consider that. Also, for those that have patents and that's what you got, this might give you the impetus to think about creating a startup. For patent attorneys, my friends, a lot of my friends are patent attorneys, they might want to expand their vision of what a patent could be doing for their clients. If they have an inventor without a company and they think that the inventor should get a patent, this podcast will actually give you a lot of information about how to sort of encourage that inventor to get a patent, because they're really starting a startup. And also, as an audience, for those investors who might want to compare, the startup that has patents or not. But I have been seeing over the years a lot of investors who might just invest in helping you get your first patent or two. And I think that's a terrific way to get started as an inventor. And then finally, for those C-levels, CEO, CFO, et cetera, of early stage companies who want to consider maybe getting patents, this is for you, because we'll talk about the many value drivers that a patent has, just like a startup. So this is John Cronin, Invent Anything. Coming up, we'll discuss the background of why patents and startups are intertwined, and we'll discuss everything from missed patent opportunities, like a missed startup, create a startup and it doesn't work. Same with patents. And also we'll talk about how patents will fuel innovation, same way a startup would. So let's get right into it. So topic number 1 is a background. But one way of background is that I have seen many, many startups that later on down the road figure out that they wish they had patents. This is sort of a clue to me it was, that maybe companies should sort of think about starting the patent first, because they obviously have the idea and they obviously could get a patent, but they go right to the startup. Another way of background is that we have seen many people who have just had a patent decide to start a company. So the patent wasn't considered a startup, but the patent was the impetus for starting a company. So you see how intertwined these two things are, right? But the other thing is the convergence of sort of entrepreneurship, right? Starting a company, and intellectual property, getting your idea patented, has always been an interest to me and to many innovators who kind of look at these two in parallel. And if we explore the relationship between patents and startups, I think that will provide some valuable insight for allowing us to have entrepreneurs aspire more, to do more, to innovate more. So the topic of is a patent like a startup, to me, is a great way to keep continuing entrepreneurs, to inspire them to keep moving, to get that startup started. One of the things is that in today's knowledge economy, it's really true that patents are increasingly recognized as a strategic asset to fuel innovation and drive economic growth, and it helps shape competitive landscapes. So the idea of a patent is really to create information to drive the knowledge economy, but also take ownership of that knowledge. We have actually seen companies that have no patents, but base everything on trade secrets. And we've come to recognize that in those companies that do that, it only takes 1 or 2 divulgations of trade secrets to recognize they lost the whole intellectual property protection. So a strong recommendation for those companies that may believe that their intellectual property is truly in trade secrets, no problem, but always suggest to get a patent or two to hedge their bet. We also see that many individuals and organizations encounter challenges navigating the intricacies of getting patents, the same way they might navigate the intricacies of getting the startup started. So when we're coupling the idea of patents and startups, many times by going through the intricacies of getting a patent would kind of set you up for making sure you got through that at much lower cost than it would in starting the startup company. And there's many reasons behind this and observations behind this. Just the basic idea is my startup going to be new and novel? Well, if you went through the patent process and got a patent, by definition, the examiner, who has no dog in the fight, is saying that your idea is novel. Sometimes we see that there is a sort of symbiotic relationship between patents and startup, where one can get better patents or have more successful startups by keeping these sort of isolated. But by bringing them together, it produces power. So you might get a really good patent or have a really good startup, but by putting them together, you get a really good startup that has protection. Sometimes there's a misfit between patent claims and startup direction. And by this, I mean, it's really 2 lines of thinking, that someone gets a patent with claims in a certain direction, but when they start up a startup company based upon the patent, they're going in a different direction. So getting alignment between the patent and the startup is important. But when thinking about how is a patent like a startup, this causes for the need to making sure they're aligned. That if you're going to get a patent that you might consider to be a startup, you want to make sure the direction of the claims of the patent would be in the direction of the startup you want to take. One of the things is that, we see that intellectual property rights are increasingly shaping innovation and influencing all sorts of investment decisions and market drivers, et cetera. So by examining how the value of patents mirror the value of startups, one starts to learn a lot about how a sort of venture capitalist or investor might look at a balance sheet and take risk, but one could start taking a look at the patent and to see if the patent can get through. Is there prior art? Is there competitors out there that you find in the patent searching, which tells us about risk as well? So the patent has many of the same considerations as a startup. And then finally here, startups wind down when they don't work. And patents don't get renewed sometimes by not filing the maintenance fees. So in both cases, patents are very much like startups. If you don't put more money in, you lose your interest. Interestingly enough, for very little dollars, though, patents can have maintenance fees paid up to 3, 7, 11 years. So patent lasts for 20 years. So patents could be considered a great way to a startup, putting a startup quote on ice to wait for when the market comes. And I just had a client recently where that was going to be the decision, where the patents basically are too far in the future. And so we're now convincing investors to raise a little bit of money to keep enough money in the till to make sure we pay all the maintenance fees, putting the patents on ice, which is right, putting the startup on ice, which is much more difficult, right? Because if you put a startup on ice, there's a lot more expense to keeping the financials up, keeping the trade names, all that stuff, keeping some of the people. So patents are like startups, but sometimes patents are even better than startups in that regard. Let's start off with topic number 2, in terms of justification. I'll call this justification part one. There's so many justifications of why a patent is like a startup that after about 20 or 30 of these, I just stopped doing it. The parallel is so good. But one thing is, if you take a look, the patent is a legal asset, right? Well, so is a startup. You're going to have owners and people are going to have stock. So they're both legal assets. Another justification is a patent is not vague. It's very specific. The claim language determines exactly what the patent's going to be about. On the other hand, startups aren't vague. You put together a business plan and a business charter. So they both start up, right, with a very high level of clarity. A third thing about justification is it has owners. And you see, when you have a patent, the inventors assign their rights to something. Now, they could be just inventors who don't have a company yet, and each inventor holds that asset, equal and joint. Well, but sometimes you have a small company of which you put the patent in, and the inventors assign the rights to the small company. But either way, a patent has ownership, and so does a startup. Someone's going to put money in a startup, and therefore they want to know who's going to be involved and what their role is, and therefore there's an ownership for sure in a startup by the investor. Another thing is that patents really give you a very specific view of the market from the prior art analysis. So you're trying to get a patent, and the examiner is going to be looking at prior art. And basically, the examiner and you, with the patent attorney, are going to try to determine the difference between your patent and the prior art. And you may have to change your claims in order to get the patent through. So you're really going through that initial market analysis when you're filing a patent. Look at a startup, same thing. You start off with some product or service, and you start approaching potential customers, and the market tells you whether it's needed or not, and you start to fine tune it. So just like a startup, a patent helps with the market. And it's so refreshing to use the patent as the virtualization of the startup, to use the patent itself to uncover that early understanding of, is my idea that I want a patent going to be useful in a startup? One of the things is that, as another level of justification, that the patent itself, once it's finally claimed, is a market. And a startup, when it gets going, once you get your first sales, you've established your market. So just like a startup, a patent, once it establishes that it can get claims in a market area, there's a clear understanding of that. Now, one of the areas of justification is kind of interesting. Patents are worth 20 years when you file them. You have 20 years from the date you file if the patent becomes issued. So there's a timeline to patents. Likewise, there's a timeline to startups. Usually the timeline for startups is how long the money's going to last, right? Or if you put money into the startup, it starts generating revenue and profit, man, now the startup can last a very long time. And a startup that's maybe last 2 or 3 years, you no longer call it a startup, but it could be the same level of business. It could be doing $3, $4, $5 million a year and do that for the next 20, 30 years. So just like a patent that has range of 20 years, potentially by paying the maintenance fees, so is the way to start up. Now, we have a bunch of podcasts on different ways to value patents. There's one podcast, in fact, that we have on the 6 ways of monetizing or making money with patents. Look, a patent allows you to license, allows you to litigate. It allows you to have transactional value in a deal, raising the value. It allows you to help increase brand, et cetera. It allows you to increase stock price. So there's a lot of ways that patents can help provide value. So is also true of a startup. A startup may get in a particular direction because it's going to sell a product, but it recognizes while it's doing that maybe selling the service is more valuable than selling the product. Sometimes when you start a patent, you start to recognize that maybe licensing the patent is a good thing. Sometimes when you start a company and you recognize all the work it takes to produce the product, you may decide to license your technology to partners. So you see, a patent is a lot like a startup. One other thing is that all patents, when they're filed, go through the process of examination. The examiner will create what's called citations. In other words, other companies that have art where you might be citing their inventions in your invention. Or on the other hand, when you get a patent, someone might be citing your patent. These are called forward and backward citations. So by seeing citations, you actually see companies that are very close to your patent. interestingly enough, those could be competitors, right? So just like a startup, when you start up, you actually may start up knowing who the competitors are, but you may start up and find new competitors. So patents kind of have competitors, right? With citations, so do startups. Another thing is that a patent generally has the ability to have many different embodiments so that they can have different claims later on and continuations. Same with a startup. The startup gets going and it decides to move the market in a different direction and invest in that different direction. So patents and startups are really much alike. And the next thing about justifications is that in both cases, startups and patents, it's really a technology we're talking about. Almost all startups, even if you're making better donuts, there's a better way to make it with has a recipe. Call that a technology. So patents and startups are both that way. So coming up, we're going to continue with the patents and the justifications. We're going to talk about things like freedom to operate, liquidity, licensing value. We're going to talk about how you can compare the value of starting up a patent and starting up a startup. We'll discuss how they become more and more like startups. We'll also then talk about how patents create market entry and stimulate innovation, and how, for instance, patents can help us in starting up this startup, and how you can integrate patents with the startup ventures to maximize the synergy. So we're going to delve into topic number 3, which is justification part 2. Then after we do that, we'll go to topic number 4, which is the cornerstone of value, showing how both produce a significant value, startup or patent. But let's get into topic number 3, justification part 2. And as I mentioned, there's so many justifications of why a patent is a startup. The more we thought about it, the more we kept listing them, and we eventually stopped. But at least let's do another 10 or so here. But one thing is that one of the justifications is patents are easily diligenced. You can look at it, a patent attorney can look at it, it's issued, it's valid. You can see specifically the claims. You can get on the docketing system and see all the prior art that the examiner was discussing to get the patent. It's very diligent. So is a startup company, right? You can do diligence on the people, the market, the business, etc. So they both diligence. Another thing about patents is it automatically passes freedom to operate. By that I mean, once you get a patent issued, you basically are saying it's different than everything else. So if you specifically build a product on your patent, you can't get sued for all the specifics of your patent because you just got it allowed. However, there is an interesting side part, which is when you produce a product and do it exactly the way your patent says, you could have an issue where you're violating patents of others in some subcomponent. So, but one of the first nice things is as soon as you get a patent, at least you're starting to feel you have freedom to operate. Same with a startup. When you start a startup in the beginning, you've done some research to make sure that you're not just copying somebody else. So they both have this sort of beginning value of freedom to operate. Of course, the startup, as it gets going, it may trip into more competition or recognizing that it might be violating some other company's patent, but they don't start out that way. So there is a great relationship between freedom to operate patent versus startup. One of the things about another justification is it could have lawsuit potential. When you get your patent filed and issued, you have the ability to sue, and that's lots of leverage. In a startup, you have the ability to have lawsuit issues regarding what you're doing. If somebody tries to take one of your assets in your company and leave as a trade secret, there could be a lawsuit there. If someone goes into the company and then steals something from the company, there could be a lawsuit there. So it's the same kind of dynamic that when you get a patent, there could be a lawsuit because of what you own. When you start a company, you put assets in it, there could be a lawsuit by someone taking something you own. One of the nice things is that if you have a patent, you can't be sued, okay? Just getting a patent, you can't be sued for anything. You're not making anything. The only you could be possibly sued for getting a patent is if you stole the idea from somebody else and they said, we caught you stealing our idea and patenting it for yourself. But that's long in coming. That doesn't happen a lot. It does happen every once in a while. But when you start a company, just by nature of you starting a company, you can't get sued, right? But you could get sued if, for instance, you started a company where you stole some technology from somebody to start the company around. But the very beginnings of a patent or a startup is you're generally starting off with a clean slate. where, you can't get sued for just doing it. One of the things about a patent, and the same about startups, is it has country jurisdiction. So a patent gets filed in a country, US or Canada or whatever. And so that gives you jurisdictional protection. When you start a company, you're starting it in some state of law, Delaware, in the US, or in the UK. So basically your company starts in a jurisdiction, which means that the startup company has to follow the laws of that jurisdiction, right? For whatever it is, for contracts, for safety, you name it. Same with the patent. You have jurisdiction in the country you file it at. One of the things is that a patent automatically, when it's issued, or even with a provisional, you can claim that the patent is pending. And that's one of the stop signs to stop people from copying. I can tell you that when you do a startup, same is true. I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of startups, and I can tell you, as soon as a startup is announced, there are some companies that thought they were going to create a raise of money, but somebody beat them to it. So they don't proceed. Particularly if one company gets started up for 30 million, and the same company was trying to get started up for 5 to do a little bit less. So that company would try to start up for 5 million, probably won't start it up if they know someone else beat them to the punch, if you will. So basically, patents in startup companies have the same idea that it can stop copycats when it gets started. One of the things is that patents can stop competitors in one way, that once you get a patent, you can stop someone from creating a product in your country, especially if they're trying to import the product into the country. There's a lot of cases at the International Trade Committee that basically, when products are put into a country, if you have the patent in that country, you can stop companies from selling, using or selling in the country of the patent in. And when you have a startup, basically, as soon as you have a startup in a country, it's very likely that will stop competitors from outside the country to come in, because they have a lot more to sell in a market that's not their basic country. So startup companies that are starting in a country generally have a leg up on companies that are starting in another country, because they have to come across the border to sell products. One of the things about patents is that it has liquidity, just like a startup. I mean, you could sell a patent, license a patent. When you start a company, as soon as you start it, things get going, you could turn around and sell that entity to someone else, do an M&A, do a joint venture. One of the things about patents, as another justification of how patents and startups are alike, is patents have an annuity value, meaning that you could license and get paid every quarter for 2 decades, 20 years. The same way with a company that gets started up, that startups can put themselves into sort of a business model where they get paid annuities, a subscription fee, if you will. So there's a lot of parallels between how a patent can bring in annuities and how a startup can bring in annuities. And a final justification here is patents don't cost a lot to get started. I mean, maybe it's going to cost $20,000 to get a patent issued, maybe some other costs to do a little bit of research. Startup, same thing. You can start up a company for basically $10,000 or $15,000. Wouldn't have a lot in it. I mean, identifying the business, signing it up in the country, signing up legally, getting the ownership right, the paperwork, 30, 50K, then you're in business. So together, they're both very low cost. So I can tell you, with these 20 areas of justification of why a patent is like a startup, the more you talk about it, the more you'll see they're the same, the more you get convinced that a patent is a startup. So let's move to topic number 4, shall we? Which I've termed cornerstone for building value. And here I'm trying to say a patent is like a startup because they both build value. So let's talk about the ways they both build value in parallel to each other. So one of the cornerstones here is that there's longevity to the value creation. Patents offer, as I mentioned, 20 years of protection. So there's some longevity to the value it's creating, right? Startups also create, longevity as value, because they're not going to be here and gone tomorrow. They're generally going to be here, they're going to start, they're going to ramp up, they're going to produce revenues, and they could be there for a long time. Now, if you're an investor in a startup that doesn't really grow really quickly, so you can't sell the company, it's hard to get the money out. I get it. But the initial investment versus to where it gets, hopefully it grows value. And there is no business in the planet Earth that gets started not telling their investors they're going to grow value. So the both have sort of this longevity to create value. Another cornerstone value is the nature of the asset. Patents represent an intangible asset of exclusive rights to stop others from making or selling, where startups typically focus on a tangible asset, which is the creation of a product or a service. Now, here, patents and startups are different, right? Because patents are creating an intangible right, whereas startups are creating the tangible. But actually, a patent is like a startup because if you get the patent that starts the startup, now the intangible is covering the tangible. Or if you start a company that has product or services that's tangible and you get the patent, now the intangible is covering the tangible. So it's basically the nature of the assets that make these things pretty much looking the same. Another cornerstone of value is the risk and reward profile, meaning that when you're obtaining and enforcing patents, there's upfront costs, there's a lot of hurdles, but successful patents down the road could yield huge results and huge competitive advantage. Same with startups. Startups face inherent risk associated with market validation, product development, etc. But basically, once they're in place and they're growing, they can create huge returns. I mean, just think about if you owned 100 shares of Apple when it first got started and you held on to it to today, how much it would be valued, or Tesla. And so you could see how, the cornerstone of value is based upon the risk and the reward profile. So startups and patents have that same possibility. Another part of patents in terms of cornerstone of value is market timing and adoptions. Patents are granted on the novelty and the non-obviousness at the time you file the inventions. However, it may take some time for that market to be validated. Same with startups. Startups have to start at some point and go to market. And the timing and adoption of the product is critical to whether they have success. So patents and startups have the same problem, that market and adoption are important and based upon time. Another cornerstone of value between patents and startups is that, they each have monetization strategies. Patents offer all sorts of ways to monetize: license, litigation, partnership, transactional leverage, stock leverage, brand leverage. Startups do the same thing. They try to find their way in the market to produce value. Sometimes it's simple as selling a product, but sometimes it's a service that they sell on top of the product. Sometimes what they're doing is they're using their company to get acquired. Sometimes they're using it as a puzzle piece in some sort of joint venture, etc. So there's a lot of monetization strategies for companies, startups, same with patents. Another cornerstone of value of patents is that they have resource requirements. Securing and maintaining patents involve specialized expertise legally, inventors, administrative costs. They require a lot of investment over time. Resources, as I mentioned, $20,000, $30,000, which is a lot of money. But same with startups. So you start the startup, you put $10,000 down to ink up the ownership and get a legal contract. Then you have to, doing business as and put the business name up there, and then you have to raise money and all that stuff. So there's a lot of resource requirements for both the patents and a startup. I could say though that, and that's comparison, that patents have sort of less resource requirements, unless you start to consider that you're patenting things that you're going to eventually need a prototype on. Sometimes prototypes could take millions of dollars to discover how to make it really work. So in that case, if you're going to get the patent from the real work of prototypes, there's a lot of resource requirements. So there's a lot of variation here, but they both have significant resource requirements. One of the things about patents is that, and startups, is there's market entry barriers. So patents create a barrier to entry by themselves, but in order to get the patent, you have to overcome the prior art. Same with startups. They might face low barriers to get in, but then they have to start differentiating themselves with other companies that have like products. So they both have barriers to the market, and they both have to overcome that, patents and startups. One of the things about patents and startups is they both have economic impact. Patents contribute to economic growth by getting the patent issued, getting the investment into it, then transferring the technology into reality, where startups do the same thing in terms of economic impact, although basically what startups do is they drive basically the creation of jobs and basically the purchasing of support equipment and processes. So both the patent and startups create a lot of economic impact, and in different ways. Just simply getting a patent outside of paying the patent attorneys and doing what you need to innovate it to create it, the economic impact of a patent is not by itself very high. But as soon as you move anything out of the leverage point of patent to do something real with it, you're starting to create economic impact. Same with the startup. As soon as the startup sort of gets started and put together, maybe you created a couple jobs, maybe you created some business for the accountants and so on. But it doesn't move until that business tries to grow to create more hiring and more products. So that's economic impact. So they both have the same kind of parallels in getting started, and economic impact is little, but as they get going, the economic impact of both grows. Another sort of cornerstone of value is legal and regulatory considerations. It's very clear and easy to see that patents are by themselves an asset that stops others from making, using, or selling. And there are patent laws that protect the ownership of the patent. But startups the same way. They have to navigate all sorts of legal and regulatory requirements generally in business. I mean, certainly employees, you have to have a safe workplace, right? You're taxed. The IRS will tax you. There's employment law. There's data protection things you have to do. So there's all sorts of things you have to do for legal and regulatory considerations for both the patent that helps you and the startup, which it will help you to do it, but you have to do the right things. And the last thing about value is that there's a strategic alignment and synergy by combining these. So when you combine a patent with a startup, you're combining all of these things we just talked about in terms of monetization, regulatory, economic impact, etc. So there's a real cornerstone of value of a patent when it joins up with a startup, when a startup joins up with a patent. By the way, talking about the cornerstone of value of both patents and startups, as we started to look at this as a topic and putting in sort of the most obvious things, there's a whole slew of other ways that value is created through patents and startups. So they're ubiquitous. So we're walking away once again from the background through the justification to now cornerstone of value, saying, the more we talk about this, patents are startups. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the last part of the podcast where we're going to talk about things like the parallels between startups and patents and how they're strikingly interesting about how they're the same in terms of getting going. And we're also going to spend some time talking about the processes of getting a patent, and then talking about how those processes lead us to value for both. But finally, we'll talk about how the process of obtaining a patent, by definition, will prepare us for creating the startup. So hold on to your seat. We're going to get started with that in a moment. So let's move to topic number 5, the parallels between a startup, really, and then to a patent. And actually, one way to think about it, it could be parallels between a startup to a patent startup, right? In other words, I'm starting a patent, I'm starting a startup. And there's a lot of parallels. I mean, obviously, from the 20 points of justification and the cornerstone of value we talked about, you could see so many parallels that you would expect that there would be parallels between these two in terms of how they're the same and lay out. So one thing is there's parallels in innovation. So just as startups aim to bring new and innovative products to market, patents protect and promote that new innovation by granting rights. Definite parallel there. There's another parallel in that investment. Both startups and patents require investments. There's no two ways about it. Whether it's financial capital for research and the development or time or effort to build intellectual property, there's also financial capital or investment for researching and starting up a company. So there's no question there's parallels for the investment strategies. As we talked about before, there's a parallel market differentiation. Both startups and patents often require investments, but they also are doing that to get market differentiation. Like startups that differentiate between the markets that have a unique value proposition, patents by definition have to have a unique value proposition in order to obtain the patent. One of the interesting things about the parallels is that strategic planning, which we haven't talked about, has a lot to do with getting a patent or starting a startup. So one would consider, as you're inventing and to get a patent, you might think, if you don't have the experience, that you just go and get a patent on the thing you're thinking about. But as an IP strategist over 4 decades, I can tell you that when someone comes to me that wants to file a patent, after we talk about it, after we talk about the business reason that they're getting a patent, sometimes they change the whole patent they want to get. So if they're thinking that, they want to produce a widget and get a patent on the widget, after we talk, we find out that what they're really trying to do is to use the widget to basically create a new service as well. So they didn't recognize they get a patent on a new service, right? So the idea is that by understanding the business drivers, the patent that they're going to get may be different that they thought they were going to get to the one they are going to get. So strategic planning is really important in the type of patent you want. Do you want a business method patent? Do you want a system? Do you want an apparatus? Do you want a composition of matter? Do you want a group of patents in a particular value chain? A lot of strategic planning. On the other hand, same is true with any business, right? As I'm starting a business, I have to figure out whether I want to, hire people in a certain market and then build in another market, whether I want to have a big advertisement campaign or hold back on trade secrets. So there's a lot of strategic planning in both. I can tell you that another area which is extremely important is that both are dealing with risk. There's a lot of risk in, the beginnings of starting a patent because you might not get it. 57% of all the patents that are filed in the U.S. Patent Office get issued, but it takes a lot of time and effort to go through the process. I think when we file patents, we don't practice law and file patents, but we have about an 85% success rate in getting our inventions filed and patent issued. But even that, we're hoping to get the claims that we want, right? So there's always risk in trying to file a patent in terms of getting it through and getting the claims you want. Whereas the same with companies. You're trying to have risk associated with getting the money, getting the second round, getting the money on time, being able to spend the money the way you thought. There's a lot of risk in both of these. One thing's about another parallel is scalability. You see, successful startups often aim to start someplace and to grow and to scale. And that's very similar in patents. When you start the patent, you may file a patent with one direction for claims, but you intend, by the amount of information and embodiments you put in the patent, that you want to get continuations and divisionals so you can scale and grow the patent. Same way. Another parallel, which is obvious to us by doing this is, partnerships and collaborations are big for both startups and patents. When you create a patent, you're the owner of it. Maybe there's 2 or 3 inventors, and you even start a small company around the patent, so the patent goes into the company. And you're immediately using the patent and co-ownership, co-inventorship to create partners in collaboration. You may have someone pay for the patent, and they become a partner and collaborate. But just like a startup, as soon as you get 2 or 3 people together that want to start a company, and someone's going to put money in, there's always this partnership and collaboration. So there's a lot of parallels there. One of the key parallels is brand building. So when you're starting a startup, you focus on brand awareness, right? Where your reputation to customers or investors. And so you're trying to build brand in the company to build value. Same with patents. When you contribute to brand building, you can help patents create the brand. A press release, for instance, when a patent gets issued, or even filing a provisional can help create brand. I can't tell you how many companies we've worked with that file a provisional as soon as they recognize that when they file a provisional application, that they can say patent pending. And there's no review of that patent provisional at all. So you can see I can immediately build brand with a provisional patent pending, which is a great brand adder. Another parallel is regulatory compliance. And certainly both startups and patents deal with regulatory compliance and standards and things. Now, for instance, when a startups, it has to, follow the laws of the country. And, when they're producing a product, they may have to have it UL approved if it's an electronic component for consumers. Or if it's a drug, it's FDA. There's always regulations in startups, right? But the same is true for patents. There's regulations in who the inventor is, the oath of declaration. There's regulations in what can be claimed or not in the patent office. There's regulations of what could and couldn't be continued as a continuation. There's regulations in terms of, how you meet Alice issues or not to obtain a patent. Is it abstract or not? So there's so many regulations to go through the patent regulations. And there's so many regulations for startups, they both deal with them. And finally, the last area of parallels between startups and patents is long-term value creation. It's very clear that startups, when they start, they're designed to grow and to scale up, right? So there's going to be some time, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But a lot of times it takes companies a lot longer to get there. And hopefully it gets there, right? So there's long-term sort of value creation over time that you're trying to accrue in a startup. Same is true with the patent. A lot of patents are more valuable 5 years from now than they are today because the market is so infant. As the market grows, the patent becomes more valuable. So there's long-term value creation in patent as well. So you could see the distinct parallels. So even though we've justified about 20 different reasons of why patents are like startups, and then we talked about how they both produce values, it's always interesting, and in this podcast for me, to talk about the parallels between them. Once again, the more we got into this, we saw more and more parallels, but for time, we just identified 10 of them, but there are many more. So let's go into topic number 6, and this is going to be kind of fun and more specific. It's how processing and obtaining patent prepares you for creating a startup. When we do work with clients to build patents and provisionals, one of the key things we tell them is, I was just on the phone this morning with one of my clients from the UK, and we got through this understanding of what they were doing, and what they were really needing to do is to get the patents so that they could then get the engineering and software firm to work with them to create the product. And they hadn't recognized until we pointed them out that the 2 or 3 patents that we're going to build, enable, and file will essentially be the blueprints for those engineers and software programmers. Because of that, they approved the project immediately. You see, they weren't just going for the patent, I'm sorry. They were actually designing the enablement of it. And so using that and coming into this topic of processing and obtaining a patent prepares you for creating a startup, there's a number of points that can be made. One is market research. So if you think about it, the patent by definition is doing market research because the examiner is going to force a review of your patent against the prior art. So it turns out market research is critical. Same is true with any startup. And so by doing the patent, you're actually doing the market research for the startup. Another thing is product development. So in preparing for a startup, you have to get the blueprints together, if you will, the designs, the software stacks, the wire diagrams, the prototype on the bench. Do product development. Well, when you're getting a patent, you have to do that virtually. You have to know how to enable it, how to make it, so to tell the examiner. So you're doing the exact same things. As a matter of fact, I will tell you that by going to a patent before a startup, it's the cheapest way in the world to figure out whether or not that product is going to work, because you have to enable it in the thinking for the patent. Another thing about preparing for a startup is, wouldn't you want to have a good intellectual property strategy for a startup? Well, what better way to have a good intellectual property for a startup than going to the patent first? Because when you're going for the patent, you're thinking about why I need the patent. What am I going to do with the patent? How am I going to create value with the patent, etc.? Do I want a patent and some trade secrets? Do I want 4 patents? Do I want 2? What do I want to do? Do I want enabled publications as prior art? So you're thinking about intellectual property strategy just by definition of filing the patent. So why wouldn't you file the patent? Because it prepares you for that startup. Another thing that prepares you for the startup is business planning, right? What's the business? What's the market? What's the product? What's the technology? What's the innovation? What's the protection to all that? And when you think about it that way, then the ability to create a patent is just like that, right? You're sort of thinking about, well, I'm going to get a patent. Great. Why? Why am I going to get a patent? Oh, because I'm going to use it to maybe license, or I'm going to use it for something. In other words, you're trying to figure out the business plan associated with that patent. Another thing in preparing for a startup is that all startups sort of think about, and they bring a lawyer involved to figure out what legally they have to do to start the company and any kind of legal considerations that they have to have. Do they need a warranty for their product, for instance? Is there going to be some liability that they need insurance on? And when you're dealing with getting a patent and you're going through the regulations of obtaining a patent, it forces you to start to think about, since you're enabling your invention in the patent process, what you need to do to actually make it work. And sometimes these exact considerations come up virtually while you're trying to get the patent. And sometimes, quite honestly, we have seen companies that want to get a patent and start off with just a patent to decide not to do it because they want to start a product eventually or start a company, and they see it's just too complicated, too many legal requirements. So it's a blueprint for virtually figuring out the issues you might have in starting a startup. Another thing about startup is team building. You want to put people together and build a team. People need to work together well. Well, you can pretty quickly start to see, if you have 2 or 3 people that are co-inventors, how they interact in the co-invention of getting a patent. We've seen many times, some lead inventor lead to do all the work and someone just sort of drag behind, and then all of a sudden have obsessiveness that they were the inventor. And all of a sudden you create this kind of issue, psychological issue of who's the founder and who's the inventor. And if you start to have those problems in just getting a patent, imagine what problems you're going to have in starting a startup. So team building is a great example that in starting a startup that you'll immediately see team building issues by doing the patent first. So patents do prepare you for a startup. Another thing is that preparing for a startup is the funding and investment. If you're trying to get a startup going, you're trying to attract investors. Well, imagine that you're trying to attract investors for the startup who's trying to give you money for the team, for the hardware and the software, or whatever you're doing to make the whole thing work, right? Maybe you're raising 2 or 3 million in a Series A. It's supposed to last a year and a half. Well, imagine going through the process of finding someone that might invest in the patent first. Now, you could hear, I don't invest in a patent business, and rightfully so. But you could go through the process of an investor saying, look, you can invest in the company, 2 or 3 million, but why don't you invest the first 50K just to see how we do in the patent? And so the idea is that from an investing and funding in a patent to get to a startup is a lot of the headway you would make to invest in the startup. You're essentially testing investors to see if they like the idea before you raise all the money for the startup. I could tell you, I started 4 or 5 startups myself. The greatest day and the hardest day is when the money comes in, because now you recognize that you owe the investors a return. In the beginning, you want to get the money to have your dream. But when the money comes in, you recognize you have to get a return. So it would be really important, I think, to see if investors would buy off on the fact of helping invest in the first patent before the startup. Another thing about preparing for startups is every single startup tries to create a network of people and partnerships with suppliers and vendors and potential first customers, designers, contractors. You're doing all that to create a startup. Well, same with the patent, by the way. And the patent is giving you the way to sort of prepare that path. Because when you start off the patent, what you're doing is you might have to get somebody to help you as a contractor to create a component of the invention to show you that it works. So you're networking and starting the partnership already in the patent. So it's a great precursor to starting a startup. We mentioned brand before, but in preparing for a startup, a patent helps you build brand. It's as simple as when I get the provisional, I can put it down as a patent pending. That helps. But also you'll be able to see in the prior art analysis how different you are than the prior art. If it's shades of gray and very small, it's going to be hard to have a bigger brand to differentiate yourself. So definitely the patent process prepares you for brand building. And finally, the commercialization strategy. There's the ability to use the patent to help you prepare for a startup, because if you think of a startup, it's going to commercialize. It's going to say, well, how do we get that product started? Are we going to introduce a generation 1 and then make it more robust, make it more reliable in generation 2? I'm going through that with a client right now. When you're trying to get a patent, you're paving the way for the generation 1 patent, right? And thinking about what's going to be in generation 2. So there certainly is a paving of the way, if you will, for both. And getting a patent helps you prepare for the startup. So now let's wrap up. In topic number 1, we gave a background. Here we're trying to show, how patents and startups are the same and why we even took up the challenge to discuss all this. We showed how patents are strategic assets, just like startups would do. We talked about missed opportunities arise when startups fail, secure patents. So why not try to get patents first? We talked about the challenges in obtaining patents, the challenges of securing funding, and the tight link between patents and startups. We discussed the insights into the value of patents and shed light on what investors might think. We talked about why successful startups might, get to a peak just the way the value of a patent would, but we also talked about the reverse, where there's a lot of unsuccessful startups and they may cease operations, but the patents can persist. So we kind of carved a background to try to talk about our patent startups, and even to provide that idea to you starts the consideration, which led to topic number 2, the justification. We had 10 or so justifications, things like patents offer clarity that are specific or non-vague claims. They provide a clear understanding to protect the invention, just like startups. Patents provide a platform for monetization, so do startups. We talked about market and understanding the market. Patents help you do that, so does the startup. We talked about demonstrating a value proposition. Well, the patent helps you do that through the patent process, and so the same of a startup. We talked about the time limit, 20 years, and the time limit associated with startups. We talked about sort of understanding multiple revenue streams that a patent could offer, same with the startup. And we talked about sort of citations as the way of understanding the competitors, same with the startup. They have competitors. And we talked about, different derivative products and embodiments in a patent can provide different generations of products in a startup. So there's justification that patents are startups. In topic number 3, we continue that justification in part 2. We talked about the justification for that patent is a valuable asset and has legal robustness. Same with the startup. We talked about free to operate, how there's so many parallels between the patent gives you free to operate in the beginning. You can't get sued for patent, but we also talked about in the beginning, you need to get free to operate in this first investment round of what you're trying to do. We talked about how the patents offer significant leverage against infringers. Same is true of a startup, that when a startup starts, automatically, there's a new company on the board that's going to produce this. So it's going to be hard for you to create a company if you're second or third. We talked about jurisdictions in countries, how patent is filed in a country, and how a startup is starting up in a country, and the parallels there. We talked about the potential for annuities, how patents offer the ability for licensing and revenue streams. Same with the company, that if it builds, say, a subscription model, then they're getting annuities. We're talking about things like the low costs of a patent and how starting up a company in the very beginning is low cost. So the cost structures appear to be the same. There's a lot of justification that patents are just like startups in that regard. Although patents are less, they're still not as expensive as going full bore on, going to a Series A at a couple million versus an angel round at a couple $100,000. And then we also talked about, the cost effectiveness of a patent or a startup and how they can produce returns for investors. If you invest in a patent and down the road you get a return, if you invest in a startup down the road you get a return. As soon as the startup is starting, it's trying to create value to get the return. Same with the patent. So there's a lot of justifications for why patents look just like startups. And then we started going to the immediate part of topic number 4. If the background of the consideration is the patents and startups are the same, and then you go through the justification that says, every time I look at a patent, it seems like it's a startup. It's just a different word, but they have the same aspects to them. Then the next question would be, well, what about value? Do they both build value? So we went through that. We went through the fact that there's a lot of ways to build values in patents and startups. We talked about the lifespan. We talked about the startups having rapid growth and scalability. Well, patents become more and more valuable if the patents are in a market that's growing. We talked about patents are the intangible assets. We talked about the business as the tangible assets. They're both assets. They both build value. One tangibly. Put them together, there's high value. We talked about the upfront costs and the regulatory hurdles that you have to go through to build the value. Patent is the same as startups. They both have regulatory issues. And we talked about creating barriers for entry. Certainly it's a value for a startup to not have competitors right away. Well, patents the same way. They build value because they automatically stop competitors from making, using, and selling. We talked about both contribute to economic growth, patents and businesses. And we talked about how there's a synergy between the two. In topic number 5, we talked about the parallels between a startup to a patent. The things that you're doing in the patent will pave the way for the startup. And the parallels are just amazing. When you need to get a startup going, you need to figure out what innovation is going to happen and how it's going to happen in time. The patent allows you to do that, right? Because you're virtualizing the innovation by putting it on paper and laying it out. We talked about the market differentiation, that the startup company wants to really differentiate the market. And the patent, by definition, is going to have prior art and citations to tell you what the market is. We talked about that startups generate partnerships and collaborations. There certainly is a lot of partnership and collaboration in the patent when you're getting started to essentially figure out what you're going to need to get the enablement to happen. Who you're going to bring in to help with that if it's not you. We talked about the fact that, but beyond the partnership and collaboration, things like building teams and all that are important. We talked about the sort of long-term value creation and the job creation of both the startup and the patent. And finally, we started talking about a patent as a precursor to the startup in terms of the ways that they both can create value and innovation and in the economy, which led directly to topic number 6. We started off topic number 6 talking about how the process of getting a patent is the virtualization, the blueprint, if you will, the engineering diagrams, whatever, to the startup that's going to be needed. So we talked about the process of obtaining a patent prepares you a lot for getting a startup through market research, where the prior art of the patent helps you with identifying competitors and citations, how you're doing product development in the patenting phase itself, virtually, how drafting a patent outlines the technical aspects and the commercial viability, same as in the business plan. You're collaborating with experts in the patent process, mirrors the team building efforts that you're going to need in the startup. As a matter of fact, we talked about if you have 2 or 3 inventors in a patent and they can't work well together, what makes you think they're going to work well together in a company? So there's a lot of things you're doing in the patent process that's helping you with the startup. Also, the funding. We talked about the idea of if you're trying to get an investor to invest in the business, maybe having the investor see that they can invest early on in the patent first to see how that goes might be the safest way they can get into that final investment into the business. So there's a lot of paving the way there. We even talked about things like commercialization strategies, where basically all startups need to figure that out over time. When you have a patent, you're kind of working through that virtually, figuring out, in the invention, do you want to have an invention on a first generation and on a second generation? And really how it lays the groundwork a patent does for a startup. And boy, there's a great synergy between patents and startups. There's differences, but there's parallels. But none is better than the process of obtaining a patent helps you so much in so many ways in order to the same process to start a startup. Now, for those listening to this that have done a startup, maybe there'd be really good agreement that a lot of things we're talking about are true, but there are also going to be a lot of disagreements for those folks like myself that have started numerous companies. Now, wait a minute, a patent isn't a startup, and a patent can't teach me this, and a patent won't help me with that. Fair enough. I get that. I was trying to take the other tack that I don't find anybody saying that a patent really is a startup. Maybe 0.1% of the companies that I work with would even think that way. And they're startups, right? So by setting down in place this idea, is a patent a startup? The hope is with this podcast, as you start to think about that, what could happen here, and that's my hope, is that for those people that are interested in maybe getting a patent, they can be convinced that maybe there's another reason to get a patent, because a patent by definition looks just like a startup. Not only does it help, there's so many justifications for it. There's so many ways that these leverage together. There's so many ways that the patent becomes a startup, that the patent itself is a startup if it's considered that a patent is a startup. You see what I'm saying? That if the patent is a startup in your mind, you'd be more apt to get a patent and to treat it the same way you treat a startup. So the blending would become invisible. So I really appreciated you listening to this topic. It's an unusual topic, I know, but I hope in some way it's convinced you with the many ways that patents are startups, and that maybe that next decision you have will be changed because you consider that a patent is a startup. So if you like what you see, please subscribe and hit the like button below, and come join us in our blog, Invent Anything. This is John Cronin, Inventors at Work.